out of the Better Futures Forum, our sessions looking at rights and interests on the way to a net zero future. Let me just introduce myself, if I may. I'm Don Henry, Professor of Environmentalism at the University of Melbourne. I'm originally a Brisbane boy, so a Northern Australian, and my background includes the privilege of working with the Australian Conservation Foundation and other environmental organisations, and I sit on the Honourable Al Gore's board for the Climate Reality Project globally as well. It's a great privilege for me to be here today with our wonderful speakers and to be joining you. First thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm sitting on Wurundjeri land now, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and their leaders, and acknowledge their country hasn't been ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge for all of us, we're coming from Indigenous lands in Australia, New Zealand, across the Pacific, and there may be others on our audience from other places. So join with me in paying our respects to the traditional owners of the country. Thank you. I just want to encourage you to use the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen, share thoughts, research links, and participate in the Q&A. I'd like to acknowledge we've got a really privileged lineup of speakers and participants, and I'll just quickly introduce and then we'll engage individually. But we have Kera, Sherwood-O'Regan coming to us from New Zealand. It's great to have you, Kera. We've got Lousi coming to us with Tonga. Uili and I are both privileged to be trained climate leaders with the Honourable Al Gore. And we've got Pastor Ray Minniecon. Ray, I know you'll speak for yourself, but as someone from Southeast Queensland myself, I want to acknowledge your country there. But I notice you've been burning the shoe leather with a hunk of time in Perth in Western Australia and back in Sydney now, as we were sharing reminiscences about lockdown a short while ago. So we've got a great group of speakers, and we want to explore together the really important issues around Indigenous knowledge, experience and wisdom as we all need to get on the journey radically tackle the climate crisis. What we've together decided to do, the group would like to use a Pacific process called the Talanoa process, and Uili is going to kindly introduce us to that process. Uili, could I hand over to you, please?
Don Henry, all of what God has been acknowledged. With the Talanoa series, it's a common conversation in the Pacific region as well, but especially here in the Kingdom of Tonga. Talanoa is a nations during the COP23 in Bonn with the acknowledgement of the Fiji nation. So it was also taken up in Poland and Katowice in the COP24 as well. And that's where the Talanoa is facing of the conversation of bringing us what matters in a similar way, but also with the not just context, but also to hear each other. So it's a conversation that we can be able to bring each other to the table without any form of conditions. unconditionally as well. So I'm pretty kindly acknowledging this opportunity that Professor Tom Henry as a moderator, but also the other panelists on the Pacific to bring that into this. It gives us the flow of what we bring what matters for ourselves, especially with the climate crisis. Many thanks in advance for the conversation what we're going to have with the Tauranga series, and the end products of that, it will bring us to the table to set up policies too. So we may agree to disagree, we may disagree to agree, but bottom line, we may disagree to disagree, but the bottom line that we'd be able to, with the pathway to zero emissions, hopefully that we agree to agree of what the humanity needed, especially the children of the oceans. Malo with Professor Von Herren.
Thank you so much, Willie. It's deeply appreciated, and let's all try and meet the encouragement and the challenge you've given us with that process. Could I invite Kera to join us and share some thoughts and comments that will help us in the discussion that Willie's laid out? Thank you, Kera.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Kera Sherwood-O'Regan tōku ikoa, hiuri aho no te Waipounamu. So kia ora everyone, good day, good afternoon. I think it's afternoon where most of you are. I'm calling, as Don has introduced, from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm currently on Ngai Tahuriri Whenua today, where we've just recently been put into lockdown. So it's a real privilege to be able to connect with all of you across in Te Whenua Moemoeā, and I'd really like to acknowledge, of course, as Don has already mentioned, the traditional owners of that land and that whenua, as well as the whenua that I'm privileged to call from. I think when I was asked to speak on this panel, it was really exciting to hear that there would be a space like this for us to get together as Indigenous peoples and to share some of the knowledge and experiences from our communities that are really crucial in the fight against climate change. And so perhaps to ground some of my whakaaro, some of my ideas and thinking in this conversation, I'd also like to acknowledge where I've come from and where those ideas have come from, because as many Indigenous people know, the ideas and the work that we do today does not exist in a vacuum, but in fact is built on generations and a real legacy of our kaumātua, our elders who have gone before us and enabled us to have the opportunities that we have today to fight an issue as critical as climate change. So I grew up in Te Waipounamu, where I'm calling from now, and was very privileged to be surrounded by a number of Māori change makers. You might call them activists. I think in those days that was a term that maybe but people who were really critical in building the future that we have today, really critical in our language revitalization and protecting our land and negotiating so that we could have access to our lands and to our traditional cultural practices and things like that. And it's been a huge privilege to grow up learning from all of those people. More recently, I have been involved in the international space, so working with other Indigenous colleagues from around the world who are also really committed to this issue of climate change. And I think I've really learned a lot and changed a lot of the climate activism that I've had since I grew up as a 15-year-old who was very interested in climate change and climate action at a time where we didn't have school strikes or where it wasn't a popular thing to do. It was very, very niche. And I think I've really seen how in my own life, being exposed to these amazing Indigenous and thinkers and activists and change makers, that's really impacted my activism. And so I'm really excited to be able to speak on this panel, to continue to learn from others in this talanoa, as well as to be able to share some insights so that perhaps the audience can also take something from those learnings. And I think when I really consider what are the key things that I've learned over these years as I've had my own activism, my own practices challenged, and as I've reconnected to my own culture and learned more about other people's, I think some of the key things really come down to whanaungatanga And that is a term that we have in Māori that effectively means sort of creating relationships or being in good relationship with each other and relating to each other as if we were family. And when I think about this, I think about the ways in which we take action for an issue such as climate change, which is huge and overwhelming, and it can drive a lot of panic and be very scary. But I know that when we're in good relationship with each other, and when we're in good relationship with Papatuanuku, with the earth and with, with the moana, with the ocean, when we're in good relationship with the other beings in this world, then we have some really great possibilities and we have some really great ways to make that change. And so I think in the spirit of this talanoa and being able to share our stories across our different cultures, I'm really interested in the way that we relate to each other, the way that we can bring our knowledge, that we can bring knowledge from our communities who have been on the front lines of climate change for generations, and how we can be in good relationship across our Indigenous peoples, across other climate activists, across scientists, across business and government, and all of these actors who are now realizing we have to take action on climate. And I think some learning from that has really been the importance of developing those relationships in this way, where we can speak freely, where we can share our knowledge, where we can share our experiences, where we can sometimes share cultural practices where that's appropriate. But particularly when we're in good relationship with each other, we can have that trust. We can have that trust that we can share these things and it won't be co-opted, and that we will have our own safe space to discuss things, that we will have our own cultural practices respected and adhered to when we're bringing knowledge forth that can help our global movement to end climate change. So I think that's something that I'm really interested in, and I wanted to offer that to the space because I'm really interested in hearing from the other panelists, the others in this talanoa. But ultimately, I think that would be my key initial message to those who are listening in, is that we can't fight climate change effectively if we're not in good relationship with one another. Being in good relationship with one another really requires us to examine our own practices. It requires us to get comfortable asking uncomfortable questions. It requires us to really challenge each other and to think, hey, actually, maybe there's some work that I've done that I thought has been for the greater good, that has been to combat climate change, but might actually be upholding the same systems that are causing harm to other people. And so I think that would be my final thing to start off this kōrero, to start off this talanoa. My reflection would really be that if we want to be in good relationship and if we want to tackle climate change together, we have to be willing to have those difficult conversations, to learn from each other and to challenge ourselves and our own practices as well. So kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the kōrero. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you so much. Pastor Ray, could I invite you for some comments, please?
Can you hear me there, Don? Okay. I'm going to pose a question, actually, or a thought. If it was possible for our peoples who have had a deep and abiding relationship and an agreement, you could call it a treaty, a covenant, with our mother, Earth, our country, our sky, our sea, and all living beings, to keep our country in pristine environmental, ecological, and social conditions for millennia with zero emissions. Is it possible for all peoples in our land to develop a personal and collective treaty or covenant relationship with our land and country, those new visitors who've come in here, as a means of making peace, not just with the people, but with the land itself? Because our people have had an existing treaty or covenant with our lands, sea, sky, and people since time immemorial. And we've been applying our unique environmental and ecological knowledge to country, sea, sky, through all of our kinship relationships, to all the living beings in our lands, all through all of these millennia of human time frames. It's just been natural, normal for us to be connected to everything. This session is about justice for people on pathways to zero emissions. And I must say I'm a little bit of a cynic when I hear the word justice, because I remember reading about a certain character in Plato's The Republic. His name was Thrasymachus. And when I read his definition of justice, I thought, goodness gracious me, this fellow's talking about me. Because he says that justice is whatever is in the interest of the powerful or the stronger party in a given state. Justice, therefore, is only affected through power by people in power. And so I've been brought up under the old Aboriginal Protection Acts of Queensland, right up until 1967. And so I've personally witnessed and experienced the justice of the powerful in my country. And sadly, it made me a bit of a cynic. And so my cynicism has been blunted by my reflections on all of these things. But there are these glimmers of hope, and a conference like this gives me a glimmer of hope. But also in our history here, in the last 50 odd years, since 1967, 54 years down the track, I have seen things that we have done that have made me have a little bit more hope. Three things. Firstly, we had just only recently the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where all of our people got together and started to define what we meant by our way forward as a total nation, not just as an Aboriginal people. And they made this quote. It's what they said: sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral ties between land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be reunited with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded. It's never been extinguished. It coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. So I'm asking this question: how do we develop a treaty in this country that actually goes beyond political things and anchors it into the actual soil, the land itself? And I base this on a couple of declarations that have come out of our High Court decisions. I'm going to make these declarations. I've actually used these declarations from the High Court decisions to say these things. I want to declare today that all Indigenous peoples are entitled, as against the whole world, to four things: to possession, occupation, use, and enjoyment of the lands of their ancestors. Two, I can also declare on these High Court decisions, I can declare that all Indigenous peoples are not outsiders or foreigners in their own lands. They are the descendants of the first people of their country, the original inhabitants, and they are to be recognized as such. Thirdly, I can declare, based upon these two High Court decisions, that none of the events of invasion, settlement, federation, or the advent of foreign citizenship laws have displaced the unique position of Indigenous peoples with their lands. And fourthly, I can also declare that Indigenous peoples have a unique connection to their country. It is not just ancestry or birth or place of birth or even both. Indigenous peoples have a connection with the land, waters, and skies under Indigenous laws and customs. And no imposed Citizenship Act has removed or modified that connection. No Parliament or foreign government has removed or modified that connection by any other laws or legislation. Now, those four declarations are based on two decisions by the High Court here in Australia: the Mabo decision and the Love and Trump decisions. And so what it is highlighting there is that the land for us is alive and sacred. Our ancestors are important to us. We know how to walk backwards into the future. We're connected. Our connection and interaction is among all life forms and beings in our country. And our country is sacred. And we want to collaborate. We want to work with others to make sure that our country is protected. And perhaps the first idea or notion I want to get across today is that perhaps we need to make a bloomin' treaty, a covenant with our country, with our land, before we destroy that. Because our connection has been from time immemorial. From time immemorial. So what do I want to see happening? You know, there's another thing that we do here in this country here now that is starting to give me a lot more hope that we're heading in that direction. The moment you get up and acknowledge the country or get a welcome to country, it's a way not just showing the respect for the traditional owners of the land on which you meet or live or have your home. It's also recognizing that continuous connection of Aboriginal people with that land. And it's good for you to do that, but it's even better if you can go to that land and make some kind of an agreement that you won't destroy it and look after it, just like our people have done for 60,000 years. You see, our connection to country is everything. It's everything to us. And that connection is beyond, as these two decisions have shown us, beyond Crown title, beyond native title, beyond Torrens title, beyond freehold title, leasehold title. These connections here don't even take those things into consideration because we know who we are, we know where we come from, we know who our ancestors are, we know our country. You know, I'll finish with this little story. There was a lady from Tasmania who I met at the airport, and she saw me sitting there. She came over and had a yarn to us, and she says, "You know, Ray, what I wanted to do in Tasmania when I bought my new home," she says, "I wanted to give recognition to the traditional owners, to the sovereign owners of the soil upon which that home that I bought was on." And so she had to go to the Lands Title Office, do that. And they had difficulty trying to recognize, because they could only recognize Crown title. But she fought for it. And what she got was a land title that recognizes the original inhabitants of that land. And so these little things, they break down my cynicism sometimes and give me a glimpse of the hope that I have for our country and for the ways in which we deal with this issue of climate change. And perhaps if people will listen to us, they might want to start to make a covenant, a treaty, not just with the people, but with the land upon which they live. Thanks, Don.
Pastor Ray, thank you so much. Could I just check, have we got Uili back or have we still got a line problem there?
Okay. You can hear me, Don?
Yes, we'll bring you in on the discussion now, please.
Well, thank you. I just want to acknowledge my team behind me are my ears for technologies and also for what I'm going to present as well. Let me start to acknowledging the previous speech from Kera and also Pastor Ray. And perhaps what I will say on that with Pastor Ray, I'll take that up as well. One of the things that drives me is kindness. And for me personally, reading the report of the last week, August the 12th, when they're releasing the IPCC report with the climate change, the impact of climate change, it is puzzling, but also it's giving me the bill of hope. What can I do personally? And what we can do together, it matters. As Professor Abeli Hauofa, one of our great sociologists, one of our great scholars of the Pacific, based in Fiji, full Tongan, he said this: We are small islands in the big ocean. And the ocean does not separate us, it's united us all. And with that voice, that's the message I'm bringing today. I bring it today for the justice of First Nation people on the pathway to zero emission. And that's a long way to go. But what I'm bringing in here is a proposal for the Kingdom of Tonga for the waste that we have right now in order to getting up to the COP26. As you know, there's a lot of importation, a lot of pollution in the ocean as well with what we consuming. And I definitely agree on the ways of what we needed to do here is myself acknowledging and also encouraging the children of the ocean, the Kingdom of Tonga, and also the wider Pacific. They belong in where they are. And with that note, if we can feel that we are part of the space, we can give solution and hope to the world. And the indigenous knowledge, which is the indigenous wisdom, is the people of the past. They live and they know fully what has been going on for many, many thousands of years. And I totally believe what we can do together matters. The Pillars of Hope is about us localizing the indigenous knowledge, but also in a level, as I mentioned on my acknowledgement, kindness is the one who will bring us together. Kindness is the one who brings us partnership and also collaborating together. And kindness is the hope for humanity. As we all know, climate change is real. Here in the Kingdom of Tonga, we are the second vulnerable nations for natural disasters. We frequently facing up to today. Yesterday, we had an earthquake here in the Kingdom of Tonga. Luckily enough, it was deeper than what we expected as well. And that, we are just in the brink. But as His Majesty acknowledging on the United Nations a speech in 2019, we are the byproducts of someone else's action. But I believe in a similar token that we can able to bring this together. And we all know how important of climate action and also important for the health of our humanity, but also for the health of our people and also children of the oceans here in Tonga. Aotearoa Pito.
Very, very much. Could I perhaps bring all of our panelists on screen, if I could have help with that. Let's for discussion. Thank you so much for the deep insights that are giving us all food for thought with the opening comments and just noting that we probably also want to share the importance of Indigenous knowledge and wisdom for the journey that we're all on to tackle climate change and build family with people, sky and sea. And also note that we've got a crucial time as we come into the COP in Glasgow, international negotiations, and I know people will be listening eagerly for any thoughts and insights you have for what is needed from all of us for that. But let's open some conversation now in the spirit of Talanoa. Thank you. And I'd welcome, if anyone, Kera, or anyone would like to lead off, please feel free.
I'm very happy to take that to take that question, but it looks like Pastor Ray, were you about to speak?
No, I was just wondering if I was on, but now I know I am. So yeah, go for it, sis.
Oh, kia ora. Yeah, thank you, Don, for opening up this corridor space. I think it's very interesting. Very interesting hearing from Pastor Ray and from Uili, and seeing the different connections that we have across our cultures and the way that we think about things. And I have to confess, I was taking notes down furiously as each of them was speaking, because I think it's, there are some real gems in here. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is the point, Pastor Ray, that you made around that walking backwards into the future, because that's definitely a concept that we have within Te Ao Māori and within my culture as well. And I think that ties really well into this piece around traditional knowledge and, what role can our Indigenous knowledges and practices actually play in addressing climate change. And the reason I think that this is really interesting is because we need to recognize, I think, collectively as nations, within our own Indigenous communities, but actually, broader society really need to recognize the importance of our knowledges and practices. And they need to recognize not only that this is really powerful knowledge that can help, address the climate that we're now facing, because as Pastor Ray mentioned, our people have been in good relationship with the land, with the waters, with with our other non-human relations for millennia before climate change became an issue. And I think that it's really critical that we recognize that Indigenous and traditional knowledge is science, but it's also more than science in the sort of Western scientific terms. I think, our methodologies have been practiced and tested rigorously, for millennia. And if I think about, as somebody who's trained within the sciences myself as well, if I think about what are those key things around scientific methodologies, it's around how we test things, how we observe things, how we have conversation to unpack what we're learning. And the reality is that Indigenous peoples have been doing that for literally millennia. The fact that our knowledge and our cultural practices have been disregarded, have been excluded, and nowadays are actually often, in many cases, co-opted by the Western Academy, I think is, to be very frank, in the spirit of this open talanoa that we're having, it's fundamentally racist. And it's actually contributed to the climate problem that we have today. Because as Pastor Ray has mentioned, our people were in these good relationships with the land, with the waters, with our non-human relatives. And of course, it didn't always go perfectly, but we have learned from that over generations. And so we have this important knowledge that can be used to tackle climate change. And I think what we're seeing now, and particularly in the lead up to COP26, is this renewed interest in our Indigenous and traditional knowledge, because the climate crisis that our communities have already been facing and have already been experiencing for a very long time, that climate crisis is now affecting those privileged people, those privileged organizations and communities that have actually kept our expertise and our knowledge shut out. And so I think, we need to be mindful that Indigenous knowledge these days is often actually being packaged up, say as nature-based solutions is a term that we've seen a lot lately and a huge interest in around the COP26. So our knowledge has been sidelined until it's been convenient for the people who have shut our communities out. And now that knowledge is very often being taken without the cultural context that needs to be wrapped around that knowledge to keep it safe, to keep it true, to keep it, to keep our communities well, and to actually be the most effective in tackling climate change. So I think for me, this sort of question around how our people have been in relationship with the land, have been in relationship with each other, and how that has informed our knowledge really, really needs to be understood by the general population and by anybody who is interested in tackling climate change, because we really need our Indigenous knowledge keepers and our elders to be able to be the ones who are guiding how that knowledge is used, who are making sure that the appropriate cultural practices are at play anytime that knowledge is being used. And I think fundamentally, our elders and our Indigenous knowledge holders really need to be involved and respected and compensated as the experts that they are, with direct access to any decision making that is happening on climate issues, climate action, whether that's at the community level to local and state governments and all the way into those international negotiations that we're seeing at COP and coming up for COP26 as well. So I think that that's a really important thing for us to recognize, is that our knowledge can be really helpful in tackling this issue, but people have to be ready to hear it, and they also have to be ready to receive it in a way that is guided by our own cultural practices. So that would be my whakaaro, just jumping off from there. So thank you.
Could I invite further discussion? Anyone would like to come in?
I think there's another aspect to these challenges. I mean, I think as just reminded us of the issues around colonisation and what has happened to Indigenous peoples out of that, in terms of the ways in which it has, I'm not going to say destroyed our knowledge, but has laid it aside or tried to push it away as if it's something that is, that you would learn in kindergarten. And our knowledge is not for kindergartens. It's not even for people with PhDs. It's beyond PhDs. It's beyond that kind of higher educational institutional stuff that we learn at universities. It's beyond PhDs and doctorates, because this knowledge has been applied successfully in ways in which it's continually made the environment as pristine as it is. Now, there is another thing that I think we're going to have to look at, and that is at COP26 and onwards, is the area around strategic planning. Now, Indigenous peoples' planning methodologies are completely different to the colonisers. We've always lived in what we call a 7-generational principles of planning. And so here we are, for example, in this particular generation, we're learning not only from my father or my grandfather, but also from my grandparents about the things that they knew and the things that they had learned. And that when I'm making a decision at this particular time in our history, whether it be me personally or socially, then we have to make sure that the decisions we make are going to be beneficial, not for my children, not for my grandchildren, but for my great-grandchildren and those yet to be born. So you're living in the 7-generational principle constantly in order to make decisions that are going to be of benefit to 3 generations in front of you and onwards. The problem we have with the colonizer is that we only make decisions for 3 or 4 years so that we can get voted in again. And so narrowing down the challenges of strategic planning, even with Indigenous methodology and techniques, is hampered by our own political systems. Now, how do you transform that? I don't know. Whether it be the political systems or your business systems or even your local systems, they have to take into consideration those kind of planning, strategic planning methodologies that don't look at profit and loss, but look at human beings as a part of the profits for the future and the benefits of the future. We don't do that. We're always looking at the bottom line. And if we can take our eyes off the bottom line and put it into our environment and our families and our communities, we might get a better result out of COP26.
Willie, would you like to continue the conversation for us?
Yes, I'd like to. And walking back to the future is the principles that we have in the Pacific as well. And I acknowledge that what Pastor Ray saying about policy making for 3 generations ahead of all of us, or 7 generations. Briefly before we came on board, I had a conversation today with a friend of yours, Professor Don Henry, Christian Nelson from Live and Learn, and he's giving his regards as well. What we were talking about as well is it's Indigenous knowledge as well. And what I'm bringing here is what I expand on the premise that I mentioned earlier about kindness. And for me, basically, this is a very simple premise for me. If we cannot be very kind to the people, things are lower than us, as we call it lower, but it's not. If we are not really looking after our land, our ocean, and also everyone around us, I can't really see anything else can go further from that. One of the things that I do in the Kingdom of Tonga, I feed the stray dogs here in Tonga, the mother dogs in Tonga. Because, you know, for me personally, it gives me awareness. We're all one, and we are not bigger than anyone else. And that's personal for me. And bringing that into the equation here, walking back to the future, we have an old saying about yesterday, or the ancient time, we called it Onoaho. And today, we call that Onoboni. In other words, Onoaho means daylight. Things that appear to us as it was, but daylight. What we are seeing today is darkness, or we are in the midnight. So we cannot really see what we are doing today. And the only way we're going to do today to walk forward, we have to walk back to the future by understanding all of what we learned from the future, from the past, and it's bringing us guideline as well. And my colleague, and as a friend of mine, wrote about this in his work in academia, Professor Augustino Mahina, about walking back to the future. So what I'm saying here, mentioning how important of us is a live and learn. Christian mentioned it today. Important of partnership, important of being fearless. But for me, it's being fearless with purpose, being fearless with working together, being fearless of understanding humanity, being fearless of purposefully knowing that I'm part of the space. I am full Tongan, and I'm a proud Tongan. And how do you know that I'm a proud Tongan? Because I walk bare feet in the sands of Tonga. I walk bare feet on the grass as much as I could. And I ask the soil. I look up to the stars to guide me. And the only way I can really know all of this, or bring us together, we connect one another only through of how we feel from within. And I believe strongly, all of us has a responsibility, as we are part of the problems, but also we are part of the greater solution. And our voice, it counts. It really counts on a bigger level. And hopefully the United Nations are watching, the policymakers are watching. Our voices are matters, not because of who we are. It's the children behind all of us. The unseen, the unborn of the future of our humanity, of our future of the Pacific Ocean. What we can do it all together. And the only way we can do it all together, we agree there is a crisis, a climate crisis. And it's affected economy, affected social reform, affected humanity on our health and also our well-being. And I'm hoping that we're all going to come together in the voices of the children of the ocean and the children of the Mother Earth. Malo apito.
Let me just encourage education, thank you. And if anyone just jumps in, that's great.
Kia ora. Yeah, I would love to jump in just very briefly. I think it's wonderful to hear from both Pastor Ray and of course from Uili as well. And I think this is giving me a really lovely energy to take forward into this COP26 space, where we are thinking around how do we make sure that our Indigenous peoples and our frontline communities, including Indigenous disabled people and disabled people, how do we make sure that we're actually being able to come together, as you were saying, and how do we make sure that we're able to actually tackle these issues at the COP? And just one of the things that has really come to my mind as you know, and as Uili have been speaking, is around this COP26. You know, what is the message that we want to have for, you know, states, for other decision makers, for civil society who are engaging in that COP26 space? And I think that Pastor Ray really brought a point up that made me really think about this, because he was sharing around those strategic planning methodologies. And similarly, in Aotearoa, we also have this concept about 7 generations. And that's something that my poa, my grandfather, has repeated many, many times over my life. I've heard him say, you know, we need to plan for 7 generations ahead. And I think that one of the things we really need to recognize in this COP space going forward to this COP, I would say is number one, I don't think that the UNFCCC is the one and only place for climate action. I think that in our own communities, as was already alluded to by Pastor Ray and Uili, you know, talking around those connections that we're having actually at home. And I think that the climate action occurring at home is fundamentally the most transformative. But in my experience within the COP space, within the UNFCCC, and seeing the work of other Indigenous colleagues within our Indigenous Peoples Caucus there, I think it's really critical that we recognise there is a role in that international space to hold the line. We do need to show up in that international space to hold the line so that we can make sure that the rights that we do have aren't further eroded, and we can give space to our communities back home to take that really authentic and important frontline action. And I think my message and my concern around this COP26 is that we need to ensure that those strategic planning methodologies colonizer are as much as possible transformed to enable Indigenous peoples to participate effectively. We need to recognise that within the current UN and international processes we have, our Indigenous peoples and our Indigenous nations are not recognised as sovereign. We don't have the ability to engage and negotiate at the UN as sovereign people. We have to consistently go through governments and other intermediaries to get our voices across and to get our voices heard. And obviously within the next couple of months, I don't think, unfortunately, I'm very optimistic, but I am also somewhat of a realist. And within the next couple of months, unfortunately, I can't see that process changing. But what I think everybody who is listening to this call can do is to ensure that within your own organizations, if you're intending to show up to that COP space, if you're a government or state party, part of a state delegation, one of the things that you can do is actually seed space, so we can make sure that as much as possible, when we're having a global negotiation in the middle of a pandemic that disproportionately affects Indigenous, disabled, and other frontline communities, we need to seed space and ensure that those voices are the ones actually being heard. And I would really, really encourage encourage anyone in that space or who's considering about taking action at home regarding the COP, or who's actually going to be attending in person or virtually any side events, you need to seed space and you need to make sure that Indigenous voices are centered. And I think that it's really critical that we take that on board for this COP, because as much as we can't change the whole UN system in the next couple of months, we actually really desperately need Indigenous voices at this COP in particular, because we can't just recreate the same systems of decision-making, the same systems of government, and the same systems of governance that have caused the climate crisis in the first place. And I think that goes back to, walking backwards into the future. We've seen how our ancestors have been able to do things. We've been able to be in good relationship with each other and come up with decisions that actually work for those 7 generations ahead. And I think that that is something we really need to see happening at the COP. So I just really, hearing Pastor Ray talk about that strategic planning methodology, I think is really, really critical, because we're not kindergartners. Our people's knowledge is valuable, and our people's knowledge is actually really critical if we want a successful outcome at COP in general, but particularly at a COP that is occurring in the middle of this pandemic.
Kera,
Thank you.
A wonderful summary and call to action. I just want to acknowledge that and cede that to you. We have to be a little mindful of time, fortunately. And so I think help work with our organisers. If I may ask Uili just to close the Talanoa with thanks. Uili?
Thank you, John. Truly is a very humble to close the conversation and the panel on behalf of the children of the ocean, and also the Justice for First Nation people on the pathway to zero emission. May I say, everyone contributing on this on the highest level, and it represented majority of our people's desires and need as well. As we all know, the COP26 is the blue COP, and it's dedicated to the Pacific region. And I'm thankful that Australia and also the Better Future of Australia take opportunity in organising this to raise our voice as a pre-COP voices, what we can do as a pathway. And I totally agree in many levels of what we have been shared as well. And through the Tānoa series, may I just say, the blessing be upon you and upon all of us. We can go forward with our strength, our will, and we'll be able to make changes and give hope, not only to our children, but to our children's children. And that will be our legacy, and we'll count on that. Malo pito, siota tu au whātua. And thank you from the Clean Queen Tonga for enabling me to sit in the boardroom and work with me for the future, and also for our voices here in the Kingdom of Tonga. Malo apito, siota tu au whātua. Malo tō.
And bless you, my brother.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Photo.
Are we out of here? Are we out of here now? How do we get out?